Renwick House kept its candles burning low and its doors flung wide for the third grand ball of the Duke's marriage, and no one below the great staircase marked the moment when its mistress ceased, for the space of an hour, to exist. The Duchess of Renwick went up the back stair in a pale green silk gown, worth more than a year of the wages of the girl whose apron she now tied over it. The fine fabric bunched and pinned beneath coarse gray wool, her pearl combs already tucked inside her glove. She moved through the servants' passage the way she had once moved through her father's mill yard as a girl, quick and unremarked, a woman who had spent the first 20 years of her life learning precisely how to be overlooked. It was a skill the Tun had never managed to teach her, and one she had never quite unlearned. Below, the orchestra came to the end of a cotillion, and 300 candles went on burning over 300 guests who did not yet know their hostess was gone. The great chandelier threw its light down over silk and diamonds and the particular glitter of a room that existed to be looked at, and at the top of the staircase the Duke of Renwick stood receiving compliments on his wife's gown with no notion, yet that the gown in question had already gone up the back stair without her in it. 2 footmen carried in fresh trays of hothouse grapes and champagne, and a dowager in violet silk watched the doorway with the particular attention of a woman counting who arrived and who did not, and what it might mean for either. No one in that glittering room thought to count the mistress of the house among the missing, because no one in that room had ever quite learned to look for her at all. She paused at the scullery door only long enough to draw the hood of a borrowed cloak over her hair and to press 2 fingers briefly against a small tin box in her apron pocket, checking that its clasp had held. Then she let herself out into the mews, into the smell of horse and coal smoke, and the first fine snow of February. And she did not look back at the lit windows of the house that had, 8 months before, become hers. She did not yet know that her husband had already noticed her chair standing empty. She did not yet know what it would cost either of them, before the night was through, for the whole of Mayfair to learn where their Duchess had gone, and why. She knew only that old Barnaby Coe was failing in a cold room above the stables, that a granddaughter of 7 was sitting alone with him, and that no physician had troubled himself to come. You may already suspect what sort of woman slips out of her own ball in a borrowed apron rather than send a servant in her place. Stay a while, and you will learn precisely what it cost her to be that sort of woman in a house that had married her for everything except that. 8 months before, Anne Fairholt had been a wool merchant's daughter, with chalk dust on her cuffs and her late mother's herb book near memorized to the page, and she had married a duke she had met exactly 4 times. Their first meeting had lasted the length of a single dance, at an assembly she had attended only because her father hoped, quietly, that some connection might be made that would spare him the indignity of admitting his mills stood 2 seasons from ruin. Their second meeting had been a solicitor's office, dense with talk of settlements and entail, in which Anne had been asked her opinion on nothing at all. Their third had been the wedding breakfast at her father's house, and their fourth had been the wedding itself. 3 weeks later, in a church full of Renwick relations who had come, she understood even then to inspect the transaction, rather than to bless it. The marriage had saved her father's mills from ruin, and the Renwick estate from a debt no one in either family spoke of above a whisper, and everyone in London understood the arrangement for precisely what it was. She had understood it too. She had simply not understood until she stood in the great hall beneath the Renwick portraits in her wedding lace, how thoroughly a woman could be made to feel like a transaction that had already been completed. Julian Ferrers, Duke of Renwick, had been courteous to her from the first. He had also been, from the first, a door she could not find the handle to. He rose when she entered a room. He inquired, gravely, after her comfort. Once, in October, He had crossed an entire drawing room without a word to lay his own greatcoat over her shoulders when a window had been left open, and had returned to his chair before she could so much as thank him. He had not, in 8 months, asked her a single question she could not have answered in one sentence, and she had begun to suspect that this was not accident, but architecture, a wall built with great care around whatever lived behind it. The Dowager Duchess had never troubled to build such a wall. Augusta, Dowager Duchess of Renwick, preferred her cruelties visible, the better to be admired for their precision. Anne had heard the first of them on her second morning in the house, standing outside the breakfast room while the Dowager murmured to her companion in the passage beyond, unaware or unconcerned that the new Duchess stood near enough to hear every word. "She is nothing but the wool merchant's daughter got up in the Renwick diamonds," the Dowager had said, in the mild, almost fond tone of a woman remarking on weather. "One cannot dress trade in silk and call it breeding, Mrs. Pettigrew, whatever my son has been persuaded to believe." Anne had gone into breakfast and eaten her eggs and said nothing, because there had been nothing yet to say, and because some part of her, the part that had grown up watching her father bow to men who owed him money and smile while he did it, had already known that this house would require the same particular fluency. In silence she had learned in the mill yard. She had brought 2 things with her from her father's house that the Renwick fortune could not touch. The first was her mother's herb book, its spine cracked from handling, its margins crowded with her mother's small, exact hand. The second was the tin box that traveled everywhere in her reticule or her apron pocket, packed with willow bark and chamomile and dried yarrow her mother had taught her to compound before she had ever learned to dance a proper quadrille. Mrs. Fairholt had treated half the mill village in her time, had gone out at any hour to any cottage with fever in it, and had died herself of the same fever 3 winters past, and Anne had inherited the book and the box and the conviction, unshakable even in a house full of duchesses and diamonds, that a sick child did not care whose daughter tended her. She had already proven that conviction once, quietly, in a manner no one in the family had troubled to notice. In her 3rd week at Renwick House, a young scullery maid named Grace had scalded her wrist badly on an overturned kettle, and the housekeeper, fearful of the expense, had proposed only a cold cloth and patience. Anne had gone down to the kitchens herself after the household had retired, dressed her mother's honey and comfrey salve over the burn with her own hands, and returned every evening for a week to change the dressing, asking nothing in return but Grace's silence on the matter. The girl had kept it, out of gratitude rather than instruction, and the wrist had healed clean and unscarred, and not one member of the Renwick family had ever learned of it. Anne had not done it to be seen. She had done it because it was the only work she had ever been taught was entirely her own, and because being unseen, by then, had come to feel less like an insult than an old, familiar coat. The season had not been kind to her in the smaller ways either, the ways that left no mark a lawyer could argue over. She had been presented at court in February, in a gown the Dowager had chosen for her, cut a fashion behind what every other lady in the room was wearing, and had stood through 3 hours of curtsies, feeling every eye in the chamber measure the distance between a duchess and a duchess's daughter. The ladies who gathered of a Tuesday to sew for the Foundling Hospital had never once sent her a card of invitation, though she had heard, second-hand, that her name came up often enough in their conversation. She had taken, in those months, to walking the Renwick gardens alone in the early mornings before the household woke, because it was the 1 hour of the day in which no one required her to prove herself worth the diamonds she wore, and because the gardener, an old man called Fitch, who had never once heard of the wool trade's supposed sins, greeted her each morning with the same plain courtesy he gave the roses. She had not complained of any of it, not to her father, who would only have grieved to hear it, and not to Julian, who she had assumed, in those early months, would receive such complaints as a wife's ingratitude, rather than a wife's loneliness. It had not occurred to her, until the night in the stable, that a man capable of laying his own coat over her shoulders without a word might also be capable of hearing the rest of what she had never said. There had been one evening, some 3 weeks before the ball, when the wall between them had shown its first hairline crack, though neither of them had remarked on it at the time. Anne had been reading late in the estate library, curled into the window seat with her mother's herb book and a branch of candles burned down nearly to their sockets, when Julian had come in search of a ledger and found her there instead, her shawl slipped from her shoulders, her feet bare on the cold stone sill. He had not asked why she sat up so late, or what she read, though his eyes had gone briefly to the worn spine of the book in her lap. He had only crossed the room, retrieved a woolen blanket from the chair by the empty grate, and set it over her shoulders without a word, his knuckles brushing the bare skin of her neck for the length of a single heartbeat, before he withdrew his hand. "You will take a chill," he had said, which was not, she understood even then, a comment on the weather. "Go up to bed within the hour." It had been an order, spoken in the same level voice he used for every order he had ever given her, and she had obeyed it, and had lain awake afterward turning the shape of his hand over in her memory, wondering why so plain a courtesy should have left her pulse so unsteady. She had not yet learned, that night, to hear the whole of what he was not saying. She would learn it soon enough. Kneeling on a stable floor with his coat ruined and his mother's voice still ringing through the house behind them. It was Sally, the second housemaid, who brought the word that evening, slipping into Anne's dressing room while the guests were still arriving below, her cap askew from running, her breath short. Old Barnaby, who had kept the Renwick stables for 40 years and taught the young Duke to ride before the young Duke could properly walk, had taken a chill 3 days past that had settled hard into his chest. The village physician had been sent for that afternoon and had sent back word that he would come in the morning, that a groom's fever could keep until morning, that he had a christening to attend at Lord Ashfield's, and could not be troubled twice in one night for the servants of a house that was not paying his greater fee. Barnaby's granddaughter, little Peg, was alone with him above the stable, and Peg was 7 years old, and Peg was frightened, and Sally did not know what else to do but tell her Grace, because her Grace, alone among the family, had once asked after Barnaby's health without being prompted. Anne had known, hearing it, exactly what she meant to do, and exactly what she could not be seen doing it as. A duchess did not walk into the mews in the middle of her own ball with a tin of salve and a kettle of willow bark tea. Such a woman would hand every gossip in Mayfair a story that would outlive her marriage. The housemaid's gray gown and apron, however, forgotten behind the dressing-room door where they had hung since laundry day, could go anywhere in the house and be seen by no one at all, because no one at a ball ever looked twice at a servant's back. So she had pinned her ball gown beneath the borrowed gray wool and pressed her pearl combs into her glove, where they would not be missed from across a crowded room for at least an hour, and she had gone down the back stair while the orchestra played on, into the cold, toward the stable where a dying man and a frightened child were waiting for someone, anyone, to come. The stable smelled of hay and horse, and, beneath it, the particular sourness of illness in a small room. Peg was sitting on an overturned bucket beside her grandfather's cot, her knees drawn to her chest, her red-brown plaits coming loose, and she looked up when Anne pushed open the door with an expression that had already stopped hoping for help, and was only waiting, now, to see what shape the next disappointment would take. "I have come to sit with him," Anne said, crouching to the girl's height, keeping her voice low and even the way her mother had taught her to speak in a sick room. "I know a little of fevers. Will you show me where the water is kept?" Peg studied her for a long moment, the gray apron, the borrowed cloak still dusted with snow, and something in the plainness of the disguise seemed to satisfy her more than any fine gown could have done. She led Anne to the kettle without another word, and stood close at her elbow after that, watching every movement of Anne's hands as though memorizing them for later use. "Grandfather says the fine folk never come down here," Peg said eventually, in the flat, unaccusing voice of a child stating a known fact of weather. "Not even when it's bad." "I'm not so fine as all that," Anne said, and meant it more than the child could have known. "You talk fine," Peg said, studying her with the frank suspicion of the very young. "But your hands know what they're about. Grandfather says you can always tell a body's true trade by their hands, whatever their mouth says." Anne looked down at her own reddened, work-roughened fingers, cracked from lye soap and mill dust long before they had ever worn a duchess's rings, and found she had no argument to make against a 7-year-old's plain logic. "Your grandfather sounds a wise man," she said instead, and Peg, satisfied, settled back onto her bucket to watch the fever break by degrees, exactly as though she had expected nothing less all along. Barnaby was worse than Sally's account had suggested, his breath catching wet in his chest, his skin dry and too warm beneath Anne's palm. She worked the way she had watched her mother work 100 times, steeping the willow bark, wringing cloths in cool water for his brow, coaxing a few spoonfuls of the bitter tea between lips too parched to protest. She talked to him the whole while in the low, steady voice that asked nothing of him, but that he keep breathing. And somewhere in the second hour, without quite deciding to, she began to hum the same tune her mother used to hum over the same work. An old, plain melody with no name that Anne had ever learned to call anything but her mother's. She did not hear the stable door a second time. She did not know, for the better part of an hour, that the Duke of Renwick was standing just beyond the lamplight, unwilling to announce himself, watching his wife kneel on a dirt floor in a housemaid's apron, with her sleeves pushed back and her hands, ringless in that light, working over an old man's fever with a competence that no one had ever thought to tell him she possessed. He had come out to the Mews because her chair had stood empty through 2 dances, and because a duchess did not simply vanish from her own ball without a word, and because the first ugly thought that had crossed his mind, standing at the top of his own staircase counting the minutes, was not one he was proud of. He had followed the cook's whispered direction toward the stables, expecting, at worst, to find some private grief he had failed to notice in 8 months of careful courtesy. He had not expected this. He had not expected the sight of her, hair coming down, voice pitched low and sure, humming over a dying groom as though she had done such work every night of her life, which, he was beginning to understand, she very likely had. Julian did not go in. Not yet. He stood in the cold with his greatcoat still buttoned and watched his wife be, for the first time since their wedding, entirely herself. And something in his chest that had been shut for a long time moved, just slightly, on its hinge. He found that he wanted, with a suddenness that unsettled him, to cross the small distance of that doorway and take her raw, work-reddened hand in his, and never quite let it go again. He did not move. He had spent 17 years teaching himself not to want things he could not command into being, and old lessons, however wrong, are not undone in a single evening. It was Peg who noticed him first and called out, and so it was Peg who unmade, without meaning to, whatever careful distance he might otherwise have maintained. "Your Grace." Anne came half to her feet, one hand still pressed to Barnaby's brow, the tin box open on the cot beside her, her borrowed apron smeared with soot from the fire she had built up herself. She did not reach for an explanation. She had none that would not sound, to a duke, like a confession. "Do not get up," Julian said, and crossed the small room, and knelt on the dirt floor in his evening coat beside her, without the smallest apparent concern for the ruin of it. "Tell me what you need." It was, she would think later, the first order he had ever given her that was not, in truth, a courtesy. "Sit down. Eat something. Stay by the fire." He gave commands the way other men gave gifts, and she had spent 8 months mistaking the shape of them for coldness, when in fact they were the only language in which he had ever learned to say the word care. They worked through the worst of the night together, the Duke fetching water and building up the fire and holding Peg against his ruined coat, when the child finally wept from exhaustion, the Duchess steeping her mother's remedies and watching Barnaby's breath ease by degrees toward something less like drowning. Once, reaching for the same cloth at the same moment, their hands nearly met above the basin, and both of them stopped, for the space of one held breath, close enough that Anne could feel the warmth of his skin without touching it, and neither moved to close the last small inch between them. It was Barnaby's cough, wet and sudden, that broke the stillness, and both of them turned back to the work at hand with a haste that fooled neither of them. Somewhere near 2 in the morning, with the old man finally sleeping and the girl asleep against his side, Julian spoke without being asked, in the low, unguarded voice of a man who had decided, for reasons he could not entirely have named, that this woman had earned the truth of him. "He had a sister once," he said. "Eleanor. 12 years old, quick and bright and fonder of horses than of dancing. The last of his family he had loved without reservation. She had taken a fever in a winter much like this one, and their father, who believed a Renwick did not trouble a physician twice for what would surely pass, had waited 2 days to send word, certain each morning that the worst had already broken. By the 3rd day there had been nothing left for any physician to do. Julian had been 17. He had stood at the door of her room and listened to her breathing change, hour by hour, into something smaller, and he had understood, with the particular clarity of grief that arrives too late to be useful, that he would have given every acre of the estate to have sent for help 1 day sooner. His father had told him, afterward, that grief of that kind was a private matter, best carried behind a closed face, and Julian had believed him, because there had been no one left to tell him otherwise. He had not allowed himself since to want anything he could not control. "It was easier," he said, his voice very level, very quiet, "to be a wall than to be a door that might again be opened onto a room like that one." Anne did not offer him comfort in words. She reached instead and closed her hand, briefly, over his, where it rested on the edge of Barnaby's cot, and he did not pull away. And for a moment neither of them said anything at all, and the silence held more between them than 8 months of careful courtesy ever had. She felt her own pulse in her throat at the plainness of his touch, at the warmth of his hand beneath hers, at how very near his face had come to hers in the low firelight. And she understood, with a small shock that had nothing to do with the fever in the room, that she wanted him, wanted the whole of him, his voice and his hands, and the last inch of distance he had not yet let her close, with a plainness that startled her more than the wanting itself. He did not move to close it. He only turned his hand beneath hers, palm to palm, and held on as though that alone were the whole of what either of them could yet permit themselves. Should you find, one winter, that the person beside you has finally stopped guarding the door, you will understand why neither of them was in any hurry, that night, to say another word. It was the housekeeper, Mrs. Byrne, who found them near dawn, and who brought with her, along with fresh linen and a physician roused at last from Lord Ashfield's christening, news that had already begun to travel through Renwick House like fire through dry thatch. The dowager, discovering both her son and her son's wife absent from a ball attended by half of fashionable London had not troubled to wonder quietly. She had wondered aloud to a drawing-room full of guests in a voice pitched precisely to Carrie. Lady Fenwick, standing near enough to catch every word, had repeated it within the quarter hour to a circle 3 deep near the punch table, her tone rich with the particular delight of a woman relaying scandal she had not had to invent. "One does wonder," Lady Fenwick had said, behind a fan that did nothing to muffle her, "whether a tradesman's daughter ever truly learns what is owed to a house like this one. She has vanished entirely, apron and all, they say, and left his Grace to manage his own ball. What can one expect? Blood tells, in the end." Mrs. Byron, who had spent 30 years in service, and knew precisely which battles were hers to fight and which were not, told Anne of it plainly, without softening, because she judged, rightly, that a woman about to walk back into that ballroom deserved to know the ground before she crossed it. "They are saying below stairs, Your Grace," Mrs. Burns said, not meeting her eyes, "that you are nothing but the wool merchant's daughter playing at being a lady, and that you have run off, same as her sort always would, and left the house to shift for itself. I thought you had best hear it from me, before you heard it from someone crueler." Anne stood very still in the cold passage, and felt the whole of the night's warmth drain out of her at once. She had known, choosing the apron over the ballroom, exactly what she was risking. She had believed in the stable, with Barnaby's breath easing under her hands and Julian's palm warm against hers, that the risk had been worth taking, that some things mattered more than what a drawing-room believed of her. Standing now in her own hallway with the housekeeper's plain report still ringing in her ears, she was no longer certain the house she had married into would ever let her believe that twice. For one long, cold moment she thought of her father's house, of the mill yard and its honest noise, of a world in which doing right by a dying man had never once required an apology. A woman who has done the right thing and watched the world decide anyway and without appeal that she had done wrong learns a particular kind of quiet ache, one that leaves no mark anyone else can ever see. It leaves one anyway. "I would do it again," she said aloud, to no one, to the cold passage and the gray light coming up beyond the window, and found, saying it, that it was entirely true, and that the truth of it steadied her more than any comfort could have done. She thought, standing there, of her father, who had never once apologized for the smell of wool grease on his coat, and of her mother, who had gone out on colder nights than this one without a thought for what the vicar's wife might say of it. She thought of the 4 meetings that had made her a duchess, and of the 8 months since in which she had learned to walk a room without disturbing its air, and she understood, with a clarity that startled her, that she had grown so practiced at not being seen that she had very nearly forgotten there was anything in her worth the seeing. Barnaby's breathing, easing under her hands in the lamplight, had reminded her otherwise. She was not yet certain the ballroom below would agree. Grace found her on the stair, the same scullery maid whose burned wrist had healed clean and unremarked upon months before, and said nothing of the gossip already moving through the servants' hall, only pressed a cup of hot tea into Anne's raw hands and stood a moment at her side, silent and steady, before going back to her work. It was such a small kindness that Anne nearly wept over it, there on the cold stair, in a way she had not permitted herself to do over anything the dowager had ever said. She went up to change, and came down an hour later in a gown the color of dark water, her hair dressed plainly, her mother's small tin box left, for once, upstairs on her dressing table where it belonged. The ball had not ended. Some hosts, she understood now, simply could not afford for their own scandal to close the dancing early. She crossed the ballroom floor toward her chair with her chin level and her hand steady, and felt, as she had felt on her second morning in this house, every eye in the room deciding, all at once, exactly what kind of woman she must be. The dowager found her before she reached her seat, and did not trouble to lower her voice, because lowering her voice had never been the point. "There she is," Augusta said, to no one and to everyone, her fan snapping open with a sound like a struck match. "Come back at last to remind us all what breeding cannot purchase, whatever fine clothes are hung upon it. I did warn my son what he was buying." The room did not go silent so much as it went very quiet in the particular way of 100 people pretending not to listen with their whole attention. Anne felt the old instinct rise in her, the mill-yard instinct, to bow her head and let the moment pass unanswered, because answering had never once, in her experience, made the moment shorter. She was still deciding whether she had the strength to try otherwise when the crowd near the doorway parted, and the room's quiet changed its character entirely. Julian crossed the ballroom floor still in his ruined evening coat, straw and soot on the knee of it, his cravat long since discarded somewhere in the stable, his hands bare. He did not stop for his mother. He did not raise his voice. He came to a halt directly in front of his wife, in front of the whole assembled room, in front of the mother who had just finished speaking, and he reached for Anne's hand and held it, plainly, where every guest in the ballroom could see. "She was saving Barnaby's life," he said. "That is my wife." 6 words after the first, and no more than that, and the silence that followed them was not the silence of a room deciding what to think. It was the silence of a room that had, in the space of one short sentence, been told exactly what to think, by the one person in it, whose word could not be argued with. The dowager's fan closed with a small, defeated snap. She opened her mouth and closed it again. And for the first time in 8 months, Anne watched Augusta discover that a room did not always turn where she pointed it. A dowager who had built 40 years of consequence on the certainty that the room would follow her lead was learning, in front of that same room, precisely how quickly a lead could be lost. Lady Fenwick, 3 feet away, found something urgent to examine in her own gloves. Somewhere near the punch table, a gentleman Anne did not know murmured to his companion that he had always thought the young Duchess had a steady hand. Hadn't he said so? And the companion agreed, as people so often will, once the direction of the wind has been settled for them. A murmur moved through the ballroom, the particular sound of 100 private opinions realigning themselves at once, and somewhere behind Anne a lady she had never once been introduced to remarked, softly, that she had always found the young Duchess's quiet manner rather becoming. Hadn't she said so from the very first? Anne did not turn to see who spoke. It no longer seemed to matter nearly so much as it once had. Julian did not release her hand. He did not deliver a speech, though the room seemed for a moment to be waiting for one. He only turned to his mother, once, and said in a voice gone very quiet and very final, that he would thank her to remember, going forward, whose house this was, and whose wife, the dowager, for once in 8 months, said nothing at all in return, and something in her bearing, the set of her shoulders beneath the diamonds, suggested a woman recalculating, for the first time, a sum she had believed long since settled. Then Julian turned back to Anne, and something in his face, some last careful wall, had simply gone, and he asked her, in front of 300 witnesses, whether she would do him the honor of a dance, as though the whole of the night had not happened, as though it had happened exactly as it should. She said yes. Her voice did not shake nearly as much as she had expected it to. They did not speak again that night of the dowager's words, or of Lady Fenwick's fan, or of what the rest of the ton would say by morning, because by the time the orchestra found its next tune, none of it mattered nearly so much as the plain fact of his hand at her waist, and the plainer fact that he was smiling, faintly, in a way she had not once seen him smile in 8 months of marriage. When the last carriage had gone and the candles had begun to gutter, he walked her up to her own door. In the old formal manner they had kept between them since the wedding, and then did not, quite, say good-night. He stood a moment too long in the doorway, his hand still loosely holding hers, his eyes on her face as though he were memorizing it against some future need. And Anne understood that he wanted, as plainly as she did, to close the last of the distance he had spent 8 months so carefully maintaining, and that he was, even now, giving himself one final moment to be certain. "I am certain," she said quietly, answering the question he had not yet asked aloud. He bent his head then, slow enough that she might have stopped him and did not, and kissed her, soft and unhurried, a promise rather than a claim. And when at last he drew back, his forehead rested a moment against hers, and neither of them seemed in any hurry to move. "Good night, Anne," he said, using her given name for the first time since the vows that had made it his to use, and went, and left her standing in her doorway with her fingers pressed to her own mouth, smiling at nothing at all. Barnaby Coe recovered, in time as the physician had predicted he would, once the fever finally broke near dawn, and by the following week he was well enough to scold the stable boys from his chair by the tack-room fire, which everyone agreed was proof enough of his full restoration. Peg took to following the new Duchess about the kitchen garden whenever the weather allowed it, learning, in her turn, which leaves eased a fever and which only smelled as though they should. The tin box no longer traveled hidden in an apron pocket. It sat, that winter, on the mantel of the small sitting room Anne had claimed for her own, refilled each month from the still room she had. Quietly, and with her husband's full blessing, begun to keep in earnest. When tenants fell ill on the Renwick estate, word went first to the house now, and not last, and the physician who had once judged a groom's fever unworthy of a second visit found his services no longer required at Renwick at all. On the first true snow of December, Julian found his wife in that same small sitting room, the tin box open on the table before her, while she measured dried yarrow into paper twists for the village, and he came and sat beside her without being asked, and took up a twist of paper of his own, and began, badly, to help. She laughed at him, gently, for the crookedness of his folding, and he did not seem to mind in the least being laughed at, not by her, not any more. Grace, the scullery maid whose burned wrist no one else had ever known of, brought in the tea-tray herself that afternoon, and caught Anne's eye across the room, and said nothing, and needed to say nothing at all. By the following spring, the dowager had removed herself to the smaller house at Renwick Priory, a change she framed to her acquaintance as her own long-held preference for country quiet, and no one troubled to contradict her, least of all Anne, who found she wanted no victory beyond the one she had already been given. Lady Fenwick encountered that April at a garden party, complimented the young Duchess's gown with a warmth so sudden and so total that Anne nearly laughed aloud, and did not, because kindness, however lately arrived, was still kindness, and she had decided, somewhere over that long winter, to spend less of herself keeping score. Peg came to the house most afternoons that Anne could arrange it, and by June could name every herb in the still-room by both its common word and its Latin one, a fact Julian found more delightful than he ever quite admitted aloud, though Anne caught him, more than once, quizzing the girl on foxglove and feverfew with the same grave attention he gave his steward's ledgers. Barnaby himself took to sitting in the kitchen garden on fine afternoons, watching his granddaughter recite her herbs to the Duke of the house as though this had always been the natural order of things, and perhaps, Anne thought, it had been, long before any of them had troubled to notice it. Outside the window, the snow went on falling over Renwick House, softening every hard line of it, and inside, by the fire, a Duchess who had once been overlooked by design sat measuring willow bark beside a Duke who had finally, at long last, learned to be found. If Anne and Julian's story moved you, thank you for staying with it until the end.